V.I. Lenin, Conspectus of Hegel's book, Lectures on the History of Philosophy, written in 1915, first published in 1930 in Lenin Miscellany 12. Introduction to the History of Philosophy. Page 37. Footnote. Hegel, Works, Volume 13, Berlin, 1833. End of footnote. Quote, "If the truth is abstract, it must be untrue. Healthy human reason goes out towards what is concrete. Philosophy is what is most antagonistic to abstraction. It leads back to the concrete." Unquote. Page 40. Comparison of the history of philosophy with a circle. Quote, "A circle, which is a periphery, has very many circles." Unquote. Lenin's note in the margin. A very profound correct comparison. Every shade of thought equals a circle on the great circle, a spiral of the development of human thought in general. End of Lenin's note. Quote, "I maintain that the sequence in the systems of philosophy in history is the same as the sequence in the logical deduction of the notion determinations of the idea. I maintain that if the fundamental conceptions of the systems appearing in the history of philosophy be entirely divested of that which pertains to their outward form, their relation to the particular and the like, the various stages in the determination of the idea itself are found in its logical notion." Unquote. 43. Quote, "Conversely, in the logical progression taken for itself, there is, so far as its principal elements are concerned, the progression of historical manifestations, but it is necessary, of course, to be able to discern these pure notions in what the historical form contains." Unquote. 43. Page 56. Ridicule of the chasing after fashion, after those who are ready, quote, "auch jedes Geschwürge, für eine Philosophie auszuschreien." Unquote. Editor's note. To call every twaddle, a philosophy. End of editor's note. Pages 57 to 58. Excellent for strict historicity in the history of philosophy, so that one should not ascribe to the ancients a quote-unquote development of their ideas, which is comprehensible to us, but which in fact was not present in the ancients. Thales, for example, did not possess the conception archi as a principle, did not possess the concept of cause. Editor's note. Archi, beginning. End of editor's note. Quote, "Thus there are whole nations which have not this concept, of cause, at all. Indeed, it involves a great step forward in development." Unquote. 58. Extremely lengthy, empty, and tedious on the relation of philosophy to religion. In general, an introduction of almost 200 pages. Impossible! ! Volume 1 of the History of Philosophy. History of Greek Philosophy. Ionic Philosophy. Footnote. The Ionic school, or Milesian school, from the town of Miletus, trading and cultural center of the ancient world in the coast of Asia Minor, was the earliest school of naturalistic materialism, 6th century BC, in the history of Greek philosophy. See F. Engels' Dialectics of Nature, Moscow, 1954, page 250. End of footnote. Quote, "Anaximander, 610 to 547 BC, supposes man to develop from a fish." Unquote. In parentheses, 213. Pythagoras and Pythagoreans. Footnote. Pythagorean philosophy, 6th to 4th century BC, an idealist philosophy that considered the essence of all things to lie in numbers. Named after Pythagoras, the founder of a philosophical, religious, and political league in Crotona, southern Italy, that fought for the supremacy of the aristocracy. End of footnote. Quote, "Hence the determinations are dry, destitute of process, undialectical, and stationary." Unquote. in parentheses 244. In the margin next to this, Lenin has written, quote, negative determination of dialectics, unquote. This refers to the general idea of the Pythagoreans, quote-unquote number and its significance, etc. Ergo, it is said in regard to the primitive ideas of the Pythagoreans, their primitive philosophy, their quote-unquote determinations of substance, things, the world, are, quote, dry, destitute of process, movement, undialectical, unquote. Tracing predominantly the dialectical in the history of philosophy, Hegel cites the views of the Pythagoreans. Quote, 1 added to even makes odd, 2 plus 1 equals 3, added to odd, it makes even, 3 plus 1 equals 4, it, unquote. Eins, editor's note, 1, end of editor's note, quote, has the property of making gerade, in parentheses even, and consequently it must itself be even. Thus unity contains in itself different determinations, unquote. In parentheses 246. Musical harmony and the philosophy of Pythagoras. Quote, the subjective and, in the case of hearing, simple feeling, which, however, exists inherently in relation, Pythagoras has attributed to the understanding, and he attained his object by means of fixed determinations, unquote. In parentheses 282. In the margin, Lenin has written, quote-unquote harmony of the world, and, quote, relation of the subjective to the objective, unquote. Pages 265 to 266. The movement of heavenly bodies, their harmony, the harmony of the singing heavenly spheres, inaudible to us, in Pythagoreans. Aristotle, De Coelo, Book 2, 13 and 9. Footnote. Aristotle's work, De Coelo, on the heavens, belongs to his natural philosophic writings and consists of 4 books that are subdivided into chapters. In modern editions, these books are designated by Roman numerals and the chapters by Arabic ones. End of footnote. Quote, fire was placed by the Pythagoreans in the middle, but the earth was made a star that moved around this central body in a circle, unquote. But for them, this fire was not the sun. Quote, thus they rely not on sensuous appearance, but on grounds, these 10 spheres, unquote. 10 spheres or orbits, or movements of the 10 planets, Mercury, Venus, Mars, Jupiter, Saturn, Sun, Moon, Earth, the Milky Way, and the Generidae. In parentheses, antipode, question mark. Footnote, antikathon, end of footnote. Invented, quote, for an even number, unquote, for 10. Footnote, the number 10 was viewed by the Pythagoreans as sacred, as the most perfect number, embracing the entire nature of numbers. End of footnote. Quote, like all that is in motion make a sound, but each makes a different tone, according to the difference in its size and velocity. This is determined by the different distances, which bear a harmonious relationship to one another, in accordance with musical intervals. By this means a harmonious sound, music, arises in the moving spheres, world, unquote. Concerning the soul, the Pythagoreans thought, quote, die Seele set, die Sonnenstäbchen, unquote. Editor's note, quote, the soul is solar dust, end of editor's note. In parentheses, page 268, equals dust particle, atom, in parentheses, Aristotle, De Anima, Book 1, Chapter 2. Footnote, Aristotle's work, De Anima, on the soul, belongs to his natural philosophic writings and consists of 3 books. End of footnote. Next to this, in the margin, Lenin has written, quote, an allusion to the structure of matter, exclamation point, unquote. In the soul, 7 circles, elements, as in the heavens. Aristotle, De Anima, Book 1, Chapter 3, page 269. In the margin, Lenin has written, quote, the role of dust in the sunbeam in ancient philosophy Pythagoreans, quote-unquote, guesses, fantasies on the resemblance of the macrocosm and the microcosm, unquote. And here immediately are recounted the fables that Pythagoras, who had taken from the Egyptians the doctrine of the immortality of the soul and the transmigration of souls, related about himself that his soul had dwelt 207 years in other people, etc., etc., in parentheses 271. Nota bene, the linking of the germs of scientific thought with fantasy a la religion, mythology, and nowadays, likewise the same linking, but the proportion of science and mythology are different. More on the theory of numbers of Pythagoras. Quote, numbers, what are they? Dispersed through space, dwelling in independence in the heaven of ideas? They are not things immediately in themselves, for a thing, a substance, is something quite other than a number. A body bears no resemblance to it. Unquote. 254. Quotation from Aristotle, ? Metaphysic, Book 1, Chapter 9, is it not? From Sextus Empiricus? Unclear. Lenin's note in the margin, nota bene, end of Lenin's note. Pages 279 to 280. The Pythagoreans accept the ether. Quote, a ray penetrates from the sun through the dense and cold ether, unquote, etc. Thus the conjecture about the ether has existed for thousands of years, remaining until now a conjecture. But at the present time, there are already 1,000 times more subsurface channels leading to a solution of the problem, to a scientific determination of the ether. The Eleatic School. Footnote. The Eleatic School, end of 6th to 5th century BC, was named after the town of Elea in southern Italy. In contradistinction to the natural dialectic teachings of the Milesian school and of Heraclitus regarding the changeable nature of things, the Eleatic school believed in their indivisible, immovable, unchangeable, homogeneous, continuous, eternal essence. At the same time, some of the propositions of representatives of the Eleatic school, and particularly the proofs advanced by Zeno concerning the contradictoriness of motion, the so-called paradoxes of Zeno, despite their metaphysical conclusions, played a positive role in the development of ancient dialectics, having raised the problem of expressing in logical concept the contradictory character of the processes of motion. End of footnote. In speaking of the Eleatic school, Hegel says about dialectics, quote, we here, in parentheses, in der Eleatischen Schule, editor's note, in the Eleatic school, end of editor's note, find the beginning of dialectics. In the margin, Lenin has written, what is dialectics? And next to the following segment, alpha, back to Hegel's text, find the beginnings of dialectics, that is, simply the pure movement of thought in notions. Likewise, we see the opposition of thought to outward appearance or sensuous being. And next to this following part, Lenin has written, beta, back to text, or that which is implicitly to the being for another of this implicitness, and in the objective existence we see the contradiction which it has in itself, or dialectics proper, unquote. In parentheses 280. See the next page. Footnote. The next page of the manuscript contains the text given below. End of footnote. In the margin, Lenin has written, quote, Hegel on dialectics. See the previous page, unquote. Here are essentially two determinations, two characteristics, two typical features, Bestimmungen, keine Definitionen, of dialectics. Footnotes. Bestimmungen, keine Definitionen is translated as determinations, not definitions. Determination is the comprehensive conception of the object which characterizes its essential aspects and connections with the surrounding world and the laws of its development. Definition, in this case, is the abstract formal logic determination that takes into account only the external features of the object. End of footnote. Alpha, quote, the pure movement of thought in notions, unquote. Beta, quote, in the very essence of objects, to elucidate, to reveal, the contradiction which it, this essence, has in itself, dialectics proper, unquote. In other words, this quote-unquote fragment of Hegel's should be reproduced as follows. Dialectics in general is, quote, the pure movement of thought in notions, unquote. That is, putting it without the mysticism of idealism, human concepts are not fixed, but are eternally in movement. They pass into one another, they flow into one another. Otherwise, they do not reflect living life. The analysis of concepts, the study of them, the, quote, art of operating with them, unquote, in parentheses Engels, always demands study of the movement of concepts, of their inner connections, of their mutual transitions. Footnote. See F. Engels, Anti-Düring, Moscow, 1959, page 21. Also see page 264 of this volume. End of footnote. In particular, dialectics is the study of the opposition of the thing in itself, an sich, of the essence, substratum, substance, from the appearance, from, quote, being for others, unquote. Here too we see a transition, a flow from one to the other, the essence appears. The appearance is essential. Human thought goes endlessly deeper from appearance to essence, from essence of the first order as it were, to essence of the second order, and so on without end. Dialectics in the proper sense is the study of contradiction in the very essence of objects. Not only are appearances transitory, mobile, fluid, demarcated only by conventional boundaries, but the essence of things is so as well. Sextus Empiricus presents the point of view of the skeptics as follows. Next to this following quote, Lenin has written in the margin, quote, the comparison is a tempting one, unquote. Quote, let us imagine that in a house in which there are many valuables, there were those who sought for gold by night. Each would then think that he had found the gold, but would not know for certain whether he had actually found it. Thus, philosophers come into this world, as into a great house, to seek the truth, but were they to reach it, they could not tell whether they had really attained it, unquote. In parentheses 288 to 289. Xenophanes the Eleatic said, quote, did beasts and lions only have hands, works of art thereby to bring forth as do men, they would, in creating divine forms, give to them what in image and size belongs to themselves, unquote. In parentheses 289 to 290. Lenin's note in the margin, gods in the image of man, end of Lenin's note. Quote, what especially characterizes Zeno is dialectics, which begins with him, unquote. In parentheses 302. Quote, we find in Zeno likewise true objective dialectics, unquote. In parentheses 309. 310. On the refutation of philosophic systems. Quote, falsity must not be demonstrated as untrue because the opposite is true, but in itself, unquote. Quote, dialectics is in general, alpha, external dialectics, in which this movement is different from the comprehension of this movement. Lenin's note in the margin, dialectics, end of Lenin's note. Beta, not a movement of our intelligence only, but what proceeds from the nature of the thing itself, that is, from the pure notion of the content. The former is a manner of regarding objects in such a way that reasons are revealed and aspects of them shown, by means of which all that was supposed to be firmly fixed is made to totter. There may be reasons which are altogether external too, and we shall speak further of this dialectics when dealing with the Sophists. The other dialectics, however, is the immanent contemplation of the object. It is taken for itself, without previous hypothesis, idea or obligation, not under any external conditions, laws, grounds. We have to put ourselves right into the thing, to consider the object in itself, and to take it in the determinations which it has. In regarding it thus, in parentheses, in parentheses, sic, exclamation point, shows from itself that it contains opposed determinations, and thus transcends itself. This dialectics we more especially find in the ancients. Lenin's note in the margin says, objective dialectics. End of Lenin's note. Subjective dialectics, which reasons from the external grounds, does justice when it is granted that, in the correct there is what is not correct, and in the false the true as well. True dialectics leaves nothing whatever to its object, as if the latter were deficient on one side only, but it disintegrates in the entirety of its nature." Unquote. Page 311. With the quote-unquote principle of development, in the 20th century, indeed at the end of the 19th century also, quote, all are agreed, unquote. Yes, but this superficial, not thought out, accidental, Philistine quote-unquote agreement is an agreement of such a kind as stifles and vulgarizes the truth. If everything develops, then everything passes from one into another, for development, as is well known, is not a simple, universal and eternal growth, enlargement, respective diminution, etc. If that is so, then, in the first place, evolution has to be understood more exactly as the arising and passing away of everything, as mutual transitions, and in the second place, if everything develops, does not that apply also to the most general concepts and categories of thought? If not, it means that thinking is not connected with being. If it does, it means that there is a dialectics of concepts and a dialectics of cognition which has objective significance. Lenin's note in the margin regarding the question of dialectics and its objective significance. End of Lenin's note. Nota bene. 1. The principle of development. 2. The principle of unity. Plus, in addition, the universal principle of development must be combined, linked, made to correspond with the universal principle of the unity of the world, nature, motion, matter, etc. Quote, Zeno's treatment of motion was above all objectively dialectical. Unquote. Page 313. Quote, movement itself is the dialectic of all that is. Unquote. It does not occur to Zeno to deny movement as, quote-unquote, sensuous certainty. It was merely a question, quote, nach ihrer, in parentheses, movements, Wahrheit, unquote, of the truth of movement. 313. Lenin's note in the margin. Nota bene. This can and must be turned round. The question is, not whether there is movement, but how to express it in the logic of concepts. End of Lenin's note. And on the next page, where he relates the anecdote how Diogenes, the cynic of Sinope, refuted movement by walking, Hegel writes, quote, but the anecdote continues that, when a pupil was satisfied with this refutation, Diogenes beat him on the ground that, since the teacher had disputed with reasons, the only valid refutation is one derived from reasons. Men have not merely to satisfy themselves by sensuous certainty, but also to understand. Unquote. 314. Lenin's note in the margin. Not bad. Where is this continuation of the anecdote taken from? It is not to be found in Diogenes Laertius, Book 6, Section 39, or in Sextus Empiricus, Book 3, Chapter 8, in parentheses, Hegel, page 314. Did he invent it? End of Lenin's note. Footnote. The reference is to the work of Diogenes Laertius, Lives and Opinions of Famous Philosophers, consisting of 10 books. It was published in Ancient Greek by G. Gibner, volumes 1 and 2, Leipzig, 1830 to 1833, and to the work of Sextus Empiricus, Basic Tenets of Pyrrhonism, in 3 books. End of footnote. Zeno has 4 ways of refuting motion. 1. That which is moving to an end must cover half of the path, and of this half, again first its half, and so on ad infinitum. Aristotle. Space and time are infinitely divisible in potentiality, page 316, but not infinitely divided in actuality. Bailey, Dictionnaire, Volume 4, Article Zeno, calls this reply of Aristotle's pitiful, and says, quote, "If one drew an infinite number of lines on a particle of matter, one would not thereby introduce a division that would reduce to an actual infinity that which according to him was only a potential infinity." Unquote. Footnote. The reference is to Pierre Bailly, Dictionnaire historique et critique, Historical and Critical Dictionary, 4 volumes, Amsterdam and Leiden, 1740. End of footnote. And Hegel writes, in parentheses 317, quote, "Dies sie ist gut," unquote. Editor's note, "This if is good." End of editor's note. That is, if one carried out the infinite division to the end. Quote, "The essence of space and time is motion, for it is universal. To understand it means to express its essence in the form of the notion." Lenin's note in the margin, correct. End of Lenin's note. As unity of negativity and continuity, motion is expressed as the notion, as thought, but neither continuity nor discontinuity is to be posited as the essence. Unquote. Pages 318 to 319. Quote, "To understand means to express in the form of notions." Unquote. Motion is the essence of space and time. 2 fundamental concepts express this essence: infinite continuity, continuité, and quote-unquote punctuality, in parentheses, denial of continuity, discontinuity. Motion is the unity of continuity of time and space, and discontinuity of time and space. Motion is a contradiction, a unity of contradictions. Überweg Heinze, 10th edition, page 63, section 20, is wrong when he says that Hegel, quote, "defends Aristotle against Bailey," unquote. Hegel refutes both the skeptic, Bailey, and the anti-dialectician, Aristotle. See Gomper's Le Penseur de la Grise, page ... Footnote. Lenin has in mind the French translation of the first volume of Theodore Gomper's work, Griechische Denker, Greek Thinkers. End of footnote. The forced recognition under the lash of the unity of contradictions without recognizing dialectics, owing to cowardice of thought. 2. Achilles will not overtake the tortoise, quote-unquote first the half, and so on endlessly. Aristotle answers, he will overtake it if he be permitted, quote, to overstep the limits, unquote. 320. And Hegel, quote, this answer is correct and contains all that can be said, unquote. Page 321. For actually the half here, at a certain stage, becomes the quote-unquote limit. Quote, if we speak of motion in general, we say that the body is in one place, then it goes to another. Because it moves, it is no longer in the first, but not yet in the second. Lenin's note in the margin. See Chernov's objections against Engels. End of Lenin's note. Footnote. The reference is to section 1 of the book by V. Chernov, Philosophical and Sociological Studies, Moscow, 1907. End of footnote. Second, were it in either, it would be at rest. If we say that it is between both, that is to say nothing at all, for were it between both, it would be in a place, and this represents the same difficulty. But movement means to be in this place, and not to be in it. This is the continuity of space and time, and it is this which makes motion possible. Unquote. Pages 321 to 322. Lenin's note in the margin. Nota bene, correct. End of Lenin's note. Movement is the presence of a body in a definite place
at a given moment, and in another place at another subsequent moment. Such is the objection which Chernoff repeats, see his philosophical studies, in the wake of all the quote-unquote metaphysical opponents of Hegel. This objection is incorrect. 1. It describes the result of motion, but not motion itself. 2. It does not show, it does not contain in itself, the possibility of motion. 3. It depicts motion as a sum, as a concatenation of states of rest. That is to say, the dialectical contradiction is not removed by it, but only concealed, shifted, screened, covered over. Quote, "What makes the difficulty is always thought alone, since it keeps apart the moments of an object, which in their separation are really united." Unquote. 322. Lenin's note in the margin, correct. End of Lenin's note. We cannot imagine, express, measure, depict movement, without interrupting continuity, without simplifying, coercioning, dismembering, strangling that which is living. The representation of movement by means of thought always makes coarse, kills, and not only by means of thought, but also by sense perception, and not only of movement, but every concept. And in that lies the essence of dialectics. And precisely this essence is expressed by the formula, the unity, identity of opposites. 3. Quote, "The flying arrow rests." Unquote. And Aristotle answers, "The error arises from the assumption that, quote, time consists of the individual nows." Unquote. Page 324. 4. Half is the equal to the double, motion, measured in comparison with an unmoving body and in comparison with a body moving in the opposite direction. At the end of the section on Zeno, Hegel compares him to Kant, whose antinomies, he says, quote, "do no more than Zeno did here." Unquote. The general conclusion of the dialectic of the Eleatics, quote, "the truth is one, all else is untrue," unquote. Quote, "just as the Kantian philosophy resulted in, quote, we know appearances only," unquote, on the whole the principle is the same." Unquote. Page 326. But there is also a difference. Quote, "In Kant, it is the spiritual that destroys the world. According to Zeno, the world of appearance in itself and for itself has no truth. According to Kant, it is our thought, our spiritual activity that is bad. It shows excessive humility of mind to believe that knowledge has no value." Unquote. 327. Lenin's note in the margin, Kant and his subjectivism, skepticism, etc. End of Lenin's note. The continuation of the Eleatics in Leucippus and among the Sophists. The Philosophy of Heraclitus. After Zeno, in parentheses, he lived after Heraclitus, ? Hegel passes on to Heraclitus and says, quote, "It, Zeno's dialectics, may to that extent also be called subjective dialectics, insofar as it rests in the contemplative subjects, and the one without this dialectics, without this movement, is one abstract identity." Unquote. 328. Lenin's note in the margin, nota bene, end of Lenin's note. Footnote on Heraclitus. Heraclitus, circa 530 to 470 BC, lived prior to Zeno of Elea, circa 490 to 430 BC. Hegel discusses Heraclitus after the Eleatics because his philosophy, especially his dialectics, was superior to that of the Eleatics, in particular the dialectics of Zeno, whereas Eleatic philosophy embodied, in Hegel's view, the category of being, Heraclitus's philosophy was a historical expression of the higher, more concrete and genuine category of becoming. This is an example of how Hegel, quote-unquote, adapted the history of philosophy to fit the categories of his logic. At the same time, Hegel's treatment of Heraclitus and the Eleatics reflected the actual law-governed nature of the history of philosophy as a science. Such deviations from the chronological order are quite legitimate in examining the history of individual aspects or categories of philosophy, since in this case their development emerges in a form free from historical accident. Lenin wrote the following in his fragment on the question of dialectics about these quote-unquote circles in philosophy. Quote, "Ancient, from Democritus to Plato and the Dialectics of Heraclitus," unquote, and remarks, quote, "Is a chronology of persons essential? No," unquote. See present volume, page 360. End of footnote. But it was previously said, see the passage quoted from page 309 and others, that Zeno's dialectics is objective dialectics. Here is some kind of superfine distinguo. Compare the following. Quote, "Dialectics, alpha, external dialectics, a reasoning which goes hither and thither without reaching the soul of the thing itself. Beta, the immanent dialectics of the object, but, nota bene, following within the contemplation of the subject. Gamma, the objectivity of Heraclitus, that is, dialectics itself taken as principle," unquote. 328. Lenin's note in the margin, nota bene. End of Lenin's note. Alpha, subjective dialectics. Beta, in the object there is dialectics, but I do not know. Perhaps it is shine. Editor's note, semblance, show, end of editor's note, merely appearance, etc. Gamma, fully objective dialectics, as the principle of all that is. In Heraclitus, quote, "Here we see land. There is no proposition of Heraclitus which I would not have adopted in my logic," unquote. 328. Quote, Heraclitus says, "Everything is becoming. This becoming is the principle. This is contained in the expression, being no more is than not being," unquote. Page 333. Lenin's note in the margin, nota bene. End of Lenin's note. Quote, "The recognition of the fact that being and not being are only abstractions devoid of truth, that the first truth is to be found only in becoming, forms a great advance. The understanding comprehends both as having truth and validity in isolation. Reason, on the other hand, recognizes the one in the other, and sees that in the one its other, nota bene its other, is contained. That is why the all, the absolute, is to be determined as becoming." Unquote. 334. Quote, Aristotle says, in parentheses, De Mundo, chapter 5, that Heraclitus joined together the complete whole and the incomplete part, unquote. Quote, "What coincides and what conflicts, what is harmonious and what discordant, and from out of them all the opposite comes one, and from one all," unquote. 335. Footnote. The work De Mundo on the universe included Aristotle's collected works, was written after Aristotle's death by an unknown author at the end of the 1st or beginning of the 2nd century AD. End of footnote. Plato in his Symposium puts forward the views of Heraclitus, inter alia in their application to music. Harmony consists of opposites, and the statement, quote, "The art of the musician unites the different," unquote. Footnote. Symposium, Feast, a dialogue by Plato. End of footnote. Hegel writes, "This is no objection against Heraclitus," 336, "for difference is the essence of harmony." Quote, "This harmony is precisely absolute becoming, change, not becoming other, now this and then another. The essential thing is that each different thing, each particular, is different from one another, not abstractly so from any other, but from its other. Each particular only is, insofar as its other is implicitly contained in its notion, unquote. Lenin's note in the margin, quite right and important. The quote-unquote other as its other, development into its opposite. End of Lenin's note. Quote, so also in the case of tones, they must be different, but so that they can also be united, unquote. 336. Page 337. Incidentally, Sextus Empiricus and Aristotle are reckoned among the, quote, best witnesses, unquote. Heraclitus said, quote, Die Zeit ist das erste körperliche Wesen, unquote. Sextus Empiricus, page 338. Editor's note, time is the first corporeal essence. End of editor's note. Sextus Empiricus, page 338. Körperliche, editor's note, corporeal, end of editor's note. Quote-unquote unfortunate expression. Perhaps, Hegel says, nota bene, it was chosen by a skeptic, nota bene, but time, he says, is, quote, das erste sinnliche Wesen, unquote. Editor's note, the first sensuous essence, end of editor's note. Quote, time is pure becoming as perceived, unquote. 338. In regard to the fact that Heraclitus considered fire as a process, Hegel says, quote, fire is physical time, it is this absolute unrest, unquote. 340. And further, in regard to the natural philosophy of Heraclitus, quote, it, in parentheses, Natur, is process in itself, unquote. 344. Quote, nature is the never resting, and the all is the transition out of the one into the other, from division into unity, and from unity into division, unquote. 341. Quote, to understand nature means to represent it as process, unquote. 339. Here is what is said to be the narrowness of natural science. Quote, we listen to their account, unquote. Naturforscher, editor's note, of natural scientists, end of editor's note. Quote, they only observe and say what they see, but this is not true, for unconsciously they transform what is immediately seen by means of the notion. Lenin's note in the margin says nota bene, end of Lenin's note. And the strife is not due to the opposition between observation and the absolute notion, but between the limited rigid notion and the absolute notion. They show that changes are non-existent, unquote. 344 to 345. Lenin's note in the margin, nota bene, end of Lenin's note. Quote, water in its decomposition reveals hydrogen and oxygen. These have not arisen, for they were already there as such, as the parts of which the water consists, unquote. Thus Hegel mimics the natural scientists. Quote, as we find in all expression of perception and experience, as soon as men speak, there is a notion present. It cannot be withheld, for in consciousness there is always a touch of universality and truth, unquote. Quite right and important. It is precisely this that Engels repeated in more popular form when he wrote that natural scientists ought to know that the results of natural science are concepts, and that the art of operating with concepts is not inborn, but is the result of 2,000 years of the development of natural science and philosophy. Footnote. C. F. Engels, Anti-Düring, Moscow, 1959, pages 21 to 22. End of footnote. The concept of transformation is taken narrowly by natural scientists, and they lack understanding of dialectics. Quote, he, in parentheses Heraclitus, is the one who first expressed the nature of the infinite, and who first understood nature as infinite in itself, that is, its essence as process, unquote. 346. On the quote-unquote concept of necessity, see page 347, Heraclitus could not see truth in quote-unquote sensuous certainty, 348, but in quote-unquote necessity, hymarmony, logos, Editor's note. Hymarmony is translated as fate. End of editor's note. Nota bene, quote, absolute meditation, unquote. 348. Lenin's note in the margin, quote, absolute connection, unquote. End of Lenin's note. Quote, the rational, the true, that which I know, is indeed a withdrawal from the objective, as from what is sensuous, individual, definite, and existent. But what reason knows within itself is just as much necessity or the universal of being. It is the essence of thought, as it is the essence of the world. Unquote. 352. Lenin's note in the margin, nota bene, necessity equals, quote-unquote, the universal of being, the universal in being, connection, quote-unquote, absolute meditation. End of Lenin's note. Leucippus. 368. Quote, the development of philosophy in history must correspond to the development of logical philosophy, but there will still be passages in the latter which are absent in historical development. Unquote. Lenin's note in the margin, the development of philosophy in history, quote, must correspond, question mark, to the development of logical philosophy. End of Lenin's note. Here there is a very profound and correct, essentially materialist thought. Actual history is the basis, the foundation, the being, which is followed by consciousness. Leucippus says that atoms are invisible, quote, because of the smallness of their body, unquote. 369. Hegel, however, replies that this is, quote-unquote, Ausrede, editor's note, subterfuge, end of editor's note, ibid, that, quote-unquote, eins, editor's note, one, end of editor's note, cannot be seen, that, quote, das Prinzip des Eins, unquote, quote, ganz ideal, unquote, editor's note, quote, the principle of the one, unquote, is, quote, altogether the ideal, unquote, end of editor's note. 370. And that Leucippus is no quote-unquote empiricist, but an idealist. Stretching of a point by the idealist Hegel. Coarse, stretching a point. Straining to make Leucippus conform to his logic, Hegel expatiates on the importance, the quote-unquote greatness, of the principle, 368, für sich sein, editor's note, being for itself, end of editor's note, descrying it in Leucippus. It savors in part of stretching a point. Footnote. In Lenin's manuscript, these 5 lines have been crossed out. End of footnote. But there is also a grain of truth in it. The nuance, the quote-unquote moment, of separateness, the interruption of gradualness, the moment of the smoothing out of contradictions, the interruption of continuity, the atom, the one. See 371 IF. Quote, the one and continuity are opposites. Unquote. Hegel's logic cannot be applied in its given form. It cannot be taken as given. One must separate out from it the logical, epistemological nuances after purifying them from Ideen Mystique. Editor's note, mysticism of ideas. End of editor's note. That is still a big job. Quote, the atomists are, therefore, generally speaking, opposed to the idea of the creation and maintenance of the world by means of a foreign principle. It is in the theory of atoms that natural science first feels released from the need for demonstrating a foundation for the world. For if nature is represented as created and held together by another, then it is conceived of as not existent in itself, and thus as having its notion outside itself, that is, its basis is foreign to it. It has no basis as such. It is only conceivable from the will of another. As it is contingent, devoid of necessity and notion in itself. In the idea of the atomists, however, we have the conception of the inherency of nature, that is to say, thought finds itself in it. Unquote. 372 to 373. Lenin's note in the margin. Materialism, Hegel is afraid of the word, keep away from me, versus atomism. End of Lenin's note. In the presentation, according to Diogenes Laertius, Book 9, Section 31 to 33, of the atomism of Leucippus, the quote-unquote vortex, Pilbel. Footnote. Diogenes Laertius, page 235. Vertiginem, Latin translation. End of footnote. Of atoms, Hegel finds nothing of interest. Quote, no interest, unquote. Quote, empty representation, unquote. Quote, dim, confused ideas, unquote. 377, IF. Lenin's note in the margin, nota bene. End of Lenin's note. Hegel's blindness, the one-sidedness of the idealist. Democritus. Democritus is behandelt, editor's note, treated, end of editor's note, by Hegel in a very stiefmutterlich, editor's note, stepmotherly, end of editor's note, fashion, in all pages 378 to 380. The spirit of materialism is intolerable to the idealist. The words of Democritus are quoted, page 379. Quote, warmth exists according to opinion, and so do cold and color, sweet and bitter. Only the indivisible and the void are in accordance with truth. Unquote. Sextus Empiricus, Adversus Mathematicos, Book 7, Section 135. Footnote. The reference is to the work of Sextus Empiricus against mathematicians, consisting of 11 books, 6 of which are devoted to a critique of grammar, rhetoric, geometry, arithmetic, astronomy, and music, and 5 against dogmatists, to a critique of logic, physics, and ethics. End of footnote. And the conclusion is drawn. Quote, we see this much, that Democritus expressed the difference between the moments of being in itself and being for other more distinctly. Unquote. 380. By this, quote, the way is at once opened up, unquote, to, quote, the bad idealism, unquote, that, quote, meine Empfindung, mine, unquote. Editor's note, my feeling, mine, end of editor's note. Lenin's note in the margin, quote-unquote bad idealism, my feeling, see Mach. Footnote. A critique of the subjective idealist teachings of Mach on sensations was presented by Lenin in his book Materialism and Empiriocriticism, Chapter 1, Sections 1 and 2. V.I. Lenin, Materialism and Empiriocriticism, Moscow, 1960, pages 32 to 61. End of footnote. End of Lenin's note. Quote, a sensuously notionless manifold of feeling is established, in which there is no reason, and with which this idealism has no further concern. Unquote. Lenin's note in the margin, Hegel versus E. Mach. End of Lenin's note. The philosophy of Anaxagoras. Anaxagoras, nous, editor's note, reason, end of editor's note. Quote, the cause of the world, and of all order, unquote. And Hegel elucidates this. Quote, objective thought, reason in the world, also in nature, or as we speak of genera in nature, they are the universal. A dog is an animal. This is its genus, its substantial. The dog itself is this. This law, this understanding, this reason is itself immanent in nature. It is the essence of nature. The latter is not formed from without, as men make a chair. Unquote. 381 to 382. Lenin's note in the margin. Nota bene, the concept of genus is, quote, the essence of nature, unquote, is law. End of Lenin's note. Quote, nous is the same as soul. In parentheses, Aristotle on Anaxagoras. Unquote. Page 394. And, ... Footnote. A word has remained undeciphered here. End of footnote. The elucidation of this leap from the general in nature to the soul, from objective to subjective, from materialism to idealism, c'est ici que ces extrêmes se touchent et se transforment. Editor's note. It is here that these extremes come into contact and are transformed. End of editor's note. On the homeomeria of Anaxagoras, particles of the same kind as the whole body, Hegel writes, quote, transformation is to be taken in a double sense, according to existence and according to the notion. Unquote. 403 to 404. Thus, for instance, it is said that water can be removed, the stones remain, blue color can be removed, red, etc. will remain. Lenin's note in the margin, transformation, its significance. End of Lenin's note. Footnote. Homeomeria. According to Aristotle, a term used by Anaxagoras to denote tiny material elements, consisting in their turn of an infinite number of smaller particles, and containing all existing properties. Quote, all in everything, unquote. The elements themselves are inert and set in motion by nous, mind, reason, believed by Anaxagoras to be a kind of fine and light matter. He explained any emergence and destruction by the junction and separation of elements. In the extant fragments of Anaxagoras' work, these elements are called quote-unquote seeds or quote-unquote things. The term homeomere was introduced by Aristotle. End of footnote. Quote, this is only according to existence, according to the notion. They only interpenetrate. It is inner necessity. Unquote. Just as one cannot remove the heart by itself from the living body without the lungs perishing, etc. Quote, nature likewise exists only in unity, just as the brain exists only in unity with the other organs. Unquote. 404. Whereby some conceive transformation in the sense of the presence of small qualitatively determined particles and their growth, respective diminution, combination and separation. The other conception, in parentheses Heraclitus, the transformation of one into another. 403. Existence and notion are to be distinguished in Hegel approximately as follows. Fact, being, taken separately, torn from its connection, and connection, the notion, mutual relation, concatenation, law, necessity. 415. The notion is that which things are in and for themselves. Unquote. Hegel speaks of grass being the end for animals, and the ladder for men, etc., etc., and concludes, quote, it is a circle which is complete in itself, but whose completion is likewise a passing into another circle, a vortex whose midpoint, that into which it returns, is found directly in the periphery of a higher circle, which swallows it up. Unquote. 414. So far, the ancients are said to have furnished little. Quote, universal is a meager determination. Everyone knows of the universal, but not of its essence. Unquote. 416. Lenin's note in the margin, nota bene, the quote-unquote universal as quote-unquote essence. End of Lenin's note. Quote, but here we have the beginning of a more distinct development of the relationship of consciousness to being, the development of the nature of knowledge as a knowledge of the true. Unquote. 417. Quote, the mind has gone forth to express essence as thought. Unquote. 418. Lenin's note in the margin, quote, development of nature of knowledge. Unquote. End of Lenin's note. Quote, we see this development of the universal, in which essence goes right over to the side of consciousness, in the so much decried worldly wisdom of the Sophists. Unquote. 418. End of the first volume. The second volume begins with the Sophists. Volume 2 of the History of Philosophy. The Philosophy of the Sophists. Footnote. Sophists, from the Greek sophos, a wise man. The designation, since the second half of the 5th century BC, for professional philosophers, teachers of philosophy and rhetoric. The Sophists did not constitute a single school. The most characteristic feature common to Sophists was their belief in the relativity of all human ideas, ethical standards and values, expressed by Pythagoras in the following famous statement, quote, "Man is the measure of all things, of what is, that it is, and of what is not, that it is not." Unquote. In the first half of the 4th century BC, Sophism disintegrated and degenerated into a barren play with logical conceptions. End of footnote. Speaking of the Sophists, Hegel, in extreme detail, chews over the thought that sophistry contains an element common to all culture, in parentheses Bildung in general, our own included, namely the adducing of proofs, in parentheses Gründe and Gegengründe. Editor's note, Gegengründe, counterproof, end of editor's note. Quote-unquote reflecting reasoning, the finding of the most diverse points of view in everything, subjectivity, lack of objectivity. In discussing Pythagoras and his famous thesis, man is the measure of all things, Hegel places Kant close to him. Quote, "Man is the measure of everything. Man, therefore, is the subject in general. The existent, consequently, is not so in isolation, but is for my knowledge. Consciousness is essentially the producer of the content in what is objective, and subjective thinking is thereby essentially active." And this view extends even to the most modern philosophy, as when, for instance, Kant says that we only know phenomena, that is, that what seems to us to be objective, to be reality, is only to be considered in its relation to consciousness, and does not exist without this relation. Unquote. In parentheses 31. Footnote. Hegel, Works, Volume 14, Berlin, 1833. End of footnote. Lenin's note in the margin, Protagoras and Kant. End of Lenin's note. The second quote-unquote moment is objectivity, das Allgemeine. Editor's note, the universal. End of editor's note. Quote, "It is posited by me, but is likewise in itself objectively universal, not posited by me." Unquote. In parentheses 32. Diese Relativität. Editor's note, this relativity. End of editor's note. In parentheses 32. Quote, "Everything has a relative truth only." Unquote. In parentheses 33. According to Protagoras. Lenin's note in the margin, the relativism of the sophist. End of Lenin's note. Quote, "Kant's phenomenon is no more than an external impulse, an X, an unknown, which first receives these determinations through our feeling, through us. Even if there were an objective ground for our calling one thing cold and another warm, we could indeed say that they must have diversity in themselves, but warmth and cold first become what they are in our feeling. Similarly, things are, etc. Thus experience was called a phenomenon." Unquote. In parentheses 34. Lenin's note in the margin, Kant and the Sophists, and Phenomenologism, a la Mach. Nota bene. End of Lenin's note. Footnote. Phenomenologism. A branch of subjective idealism that considers phenomena to be only the totality of man's sensations. The Machists were phenomenalists. An important role in the Marxist criticism of phenomenologism was played by Lenin's book Materialism and Empirical Criticism. Collected Works, Volume 14. End of footnote. Quote, "The world is consequently not only phenomenal, in that it is for consciousness, and thus that its being is only one relative to consciousness, but it is likewise phenomenal in itself." Unquote. In parentheses 35. Lenin's note in the margin, not only relativism. End of Lenin's note. Quote, "This skepticism reached a much deeper point in Gorgias." Unquote. In parentheses 35. Lenin's note in the margin, skepticism. End of Lenin's note. Quote, his dialectic, unquote, that of Gorgias the Sophist, in parentheses, many times, page 36, idem, page 37. Lenin's note in the margin, nota bene, end of Lenin's note. Tiedemann said that Gorgias went further than the quote-unquote common sense of man, and Hegel makes fun of this. Every philosophy goes further than quote-unquote common sense, for common sense is not philosophy. Prior to Copernicus, it was contrary to common sense to say that the earth goes around the sun. In parentheses, 36. Lenin's note in the margin, Hegel on quote-unquote common sense. End of Lenin's note. Quote-unquote it, in parentheses, der gesunde Menschenverstand, editor's note, common sense, end of editor's note, quote, is the mode of thought of its time, containing all the prejudices of this time, unquote. Lenin's note in the margin, common sense equals the prejudices of its time, end of Lenin's note. Gorgias, page 37, 1. Nothing exists, nothing is. 2. Assuming that being is, it cannot be known. 3. Even if it is knowable, no communication of what is known is possible. Quote, Gorgias is conscious that they, in parentheses, being and not being, their mutual sublation, quote, are vanishing moments. The unconscious conception has this truth also, but knows nothing about it, unquote. In parentheses, 40. Quote-unquote vanishing moments equal being and not being. That is a magnificent definition of dialectics. Quote, Gorgias, alpha, justly argues against absolute realism, which, because it has a notion, thinks it possesses the very thing itself, when actually it possesses only something relative. Beta falls into the bad idealism of modern times. Quote, what is thought is always subjective, and thus not the existent, since through thought an existent is transformed into what is thought, unquote. In parentheses, 41. Lenin's note in the margin, Gorgias, quote-unquote absolute realism, and Kant. End of Lenin's note. And further below, in parentheses, page 41 IF, Kant is again mentioned. To be added on Gorgias. Footnote. This excerpt was made by Lenin somewhat later in outlining the Philosophy of Socrates, pages 43 to 44 of Hegel. See page 273 of this volume. End of footnote. He puts, quote-unquote, either or to the fundamental questions. Quote, but that is not true dialectics. It would be necessary to prove that the object must be necessarily in one or another determination, not in and for itself. The object resolves itself only into those determinations, but from that nothing follows regarding the nature of the object itself, unquote. In parentheses, 39. Lenin's note in the margin, dialectics in the object itself. End of Lenin's note. To be added further on Gorgias. Footnote. This excerpt was made by Lenin in outlining the Philosophy of Socrates, page 69 of Hegel. See page 274 of this volume. End of footnote. In the exposition of his view that the existent cannot be imparted, communicated, quote, speech by which the existent has to be expressed is not existent. What is imparted is thus not the existent, but only words, unquote. Sextus Empiricus Adversus Mathematicos, Book 7, sections 83 to 84. Lenin's note in the margin, nota bene. End of Lenin's note. Page 41. Hegel writes, quote, the existent is also comprehended as non-existent, but the comprehension of it is to make it universal, unquote. In parentheses 42. Lenin's note in the margin, see Feuerbach. End of Lenin's note. Footnote. See section 27 of Feuerbach's Principles of the Philosophy of the Future for his views on being and essence. End of footnote. Quote, "This individual cannot be expressed," unquote. In parentheses 42. Every word, speech, already universalizes. See Feuerbach. Footnote. The reference is to the following statement of Feuerbach. Quote, "At the beginning of phenomenology, we immediately come across a contradiction between the word, which represents the universal, and the thing, which is always a particular." Unquote. See section 28 of Feuerbach's Principles of the Philosophy of the Future. End of footnote. The senses show reality, thought and word, the universal. Final words of the section on the Sophists. Quote, "The Sophists thus also made dialectic, universal philosophy, their object, and they were profound thinkers." Unquote. In parentheses 42. The Philosophy of Socrates. Socrates is a quote-unquote world-famed personage, in parentheses 42, the quote-unquote most interesting, ibid, in the philosophy of antiquity, quote, subjectivity of thought, unquote, in parentheses 42, quote, freedom of self-consciousness, unquote, in parentheses 44. Quote, "Herein lies the ambiguity of dialectics and sophistry. The objective disappears," unquote. Is the subjective contingent, or is there in it, quote-unquote, an im selbst, editor's note, in itself, end of editor's note, the objective and universal, in parentheses 43. Footnote. Following this paragraph in the manuscript is an excerpt on Gorgias's philosophy, beginning with the words, quote, "to be added on Gorgias," unquote. See page 271 of this volume. End of footnote. Quote, "True thought thinks in such a way that its content is as truly objective as subjective," unquote. In parentheses 44. And in Socrates and Plato we see, Hegel says, not only subjectivity, quote, "the reference of any judgment to consciousness is held by him, Socrates, in common with the Sophists," unquote, but also objectivity. Quote, "Objectivity has here, in parentheses, in Socrates, the sense of the universal, existent in and for itself, and not external objectivity," unquote, in parentheses 45. Idem 46. Quote, "not external objectivity, but the spiritual universal," unquote. Lenin's note in the margin, nota bene, end of Lenin's note. And 2 lines further down, quote, "Kant's ideal is the phenomenon, not objective in itself," unquote. In parentheses 46. Lenin's note in the margin, Kant, end of Lenin's note. Socrates called his method Hebammenkunst, editor's note, the art of midwifery, end of editor's note. In parentheses, page 64. Derived from his mother, he said, Socrates' mother equals midwife, to help in bringing thoughts to birth. Lenin's note in the margin, shrewd, exclamation point, end of Lenin's note. Hegel's example, everyone knows, he says, that Werden is, but it surprises us if we analyze, reflektirend, and find that it is, quote, the identity of being and not being, unquote. Quote, so great a distinction, unquote. In parentheses 67. Lenin's note in the margin, Werden equals Nichtsein und Sein, end of Lenin's note. Editor's note, becoming equals not being and being, end of editor's note. Meno, in parentheses, Plato's Meno, compared Socrates to an electric eel, Zitteral, which makes anyone who touches it narcotisch. Editor's note, drugged, end of editor's note. In parentheses 69. Footnote. Meno, Plato's dialogue directed against the Sophists. It is considered to be one of Plato's early works. End of footnote. And I too am narcotisch, and I cannot answer you. Footnote. Following this paragraph in the manuscript is an excerpt on Gorgias's philosophy, beginning with the words, quote, to be added further on Gorgias, unquote. See page 272 of this volume. End of footnote. Quote, that which is held by me as truth and right is spirit of my spirit. But what the spirit derives thus from itself, what it so holds, must come from it as the universal, as from the spirit, which acts in a universal manner, and not from its passions, interests, likings, whims, aims, inclinations, etc. These too certainly come from something inward, which is, quote, implanted in us by nature, unquote, but they are only in a natural way our own, unquote. In parentheses 74 to 75. Lenin's note in the margin, Tribune D, editor's note, very well put, end of editor's note. End of Lenin's note. Intelligent idealism is closer to intelligent materialism than stupid materialism. Dialectical idealism, instead of intelligent, metaphysical, undeveloped, dead, crude, rigid, instead of stupid. To be elaborated. Plekhanov wrote on philosophy, Dialectics, probably about 1,000 pages. Beltov plus against Bogdanov, plus against the Kantians, plus fundamental questions, etc., etc. Lenin's note in the margin, nota bene. End of Lenin's note. Footnote. Lenin is referring to the following philosophical works of Plekhanov. N. Beltov, The Development of the Monist View of History, published as a separate volume in 1895 in St. Petersburg. See Selected Philosophical Works, Volume 1, Moscow, 1960, pages 542 to 782. Articles against Bogdanov, appearing in social democratic periodicals, and published in the collection entitled From Defense to Attack, 1910. Articles against the Kantians, E. Bernstein, C. Schmidt, and others appearing in the journal Die Neue Zeit, and published in the collection N. Beltov, Criticism of Our Critics, St. Petersburg, 1906, and Fundamental Questions of Marxism, published as a separate volume in 1908 in St. Petersburg. End of footnote. Among them about the large logic, in connection with it, its thought, that is, dialectics proper, as philosophical science, nil. Pythagoras, quote, man is the measure of all things, unquote. Socrates, quote, man as thinking is the measure of all things, unquote. In parentheses 75. Lenin's note in the margin, nuance, exclamation point. End of Lenin's note. Xenophon, in his Memorabilion, described Socrates better, more accurately, and more faithfully than Plato, pages 80 to 81. The Socratics. In connection with the sophism about the quote-unquote heap and quote-unquote bald, Hegel repeats the transition of quantity into quality and vice versa, Dialectics, pages 139 to 140. 143 to 144, at length about the fact that, quote, language in essence expresses only the universal. What is meant, however, is the special, the particular. Hence, what is meant cannot be said in speech, unquote. Quote unquote it, question mark, the most universal word of all. Lenin's note in the margin, nota bene, in language there is only the universal. End of Lenin's note. Who is it? I. Every person is an I. Das Sinnliche? Editor's note, the sensuous. End of editor's note. It is a universal, etc., etc. Quote unquote this, question mark, question mark. Everyone is, quote unquote, this. Why can the particular not be named? One of the objects of a given kind, tables, is distinguished by something from the rest. Quote, that the universal should in philosophy be given a place of such importance that only the universal can be expressed, and the quote-unquote it which is meant cannot, indicates a state of consciousness and thought which the philosophical culture of our time has not yet reached. Unquote. Hegel includes here, quote, the skepticism of our times, unquote, in parentheses 143, in parentheses Kant's question mark, and those who assert that, quote, sensuous certainty is the truth, unquote, in parentheses 143, for das Sinnliche, quote, is a universal, unquote, in parentheses 143. Thereby Hegel hits every materialism except dialectical materialism, nota bene. To call by name, but the name is a contingent symbol and does not express Sache selbst, editor's note, the very essence of the thing, end of editor's note. How can the particular be expressed, in parentheses 144? Hegel seriously quote-unquote thought, that materialism as a philosophy was impossible, for philosophy is the science of thinking, of the universal, but the universal is a thought. Here he repeated the error of the same subjective idealism that he always called quote-unquote bad idealism. Objective and still more absolute idealism came very close to materialism, by a zigzag and a somersault, even partially became transformed into it. Lenin's note in the margin, Hegel and dialectical materialism, end of Lenin's note. The Cyrenaics held sensation for the truth. Quote, the truth is not what is in sensation, the content, but is itself sensation, unquote. In parentheses 151. Lenin's note in the margin, sensation in the theory of knowledge of the Cyrenaics, end of Lenin's note. Footnote. Cyrenaics, adherents of an ancient Greek school of philosophy, founded in the 5th century BC by Aristippus of Cyrene, North Africa. In the theory of knowledge, the Cyrenaics adhered to sensualism. They asserted that objective truth does not exist, and that, with certainty, one can only speak of subjective sensations. In Cyrenaicism, the sensualist theory of knowledge is supplanted by sensualist ethics, the doctrine of sensual satisfaction as the basis of morality. The Cyrenaic school produced a number of representatives of ancient atheism. End of footnote. Quote, the main principle of the Cyrenaic school, therefore, is sensation, which should form the real criterion of the truth and the good, unquote. In parentheses 153. Quote, sensation is the indeterminate unit, unquote. In parentheses 154. But if thinking is added, then the universal appears and, quote-unquote, simple subjectivity disappears. Phenomenologists a la Mach and company inevitably become idealists on the question of the universal, quote-unquote, law, quote-unquote, necessity, etc. Lenin's note in the margin, nota bene, the Cyrenaics and Mach and company, end of Lenin's note. Footnote. See Überweg Heinze, section 88, page 122, 10th edition, and also about them in Plato's Theaetetus, there the Cyrenaics, skepticism and subjectivism. The reference is to section 38, the Aristippian and Cyrenaic or hedonistic school, in Überweg's book, Grundriss der Geschichte der Philosophie des Altertums, 10 Auflage, Berlin, 1909, F. Überweg, Outline of the History of Ancient Philosophy, 10th edition, Berlin, 1909. In the dialogue Theaetetus, Plato expounds his mystical theory of knowledge, calling cognition the rise of reason into the realm of ideas. This rise is like recollection, since, according to Plato, reason, the soul, by their origin, belong to this supersensual world of ideas. End of footnote. Another Cyrenaic, Hegesias, quote-unquote, recognized, quote, this incongruity between sensation and universality, unquote. In parentheses 155. They confuse sensation as a principle of the theory of knowledge and a principle of ethics. This, nota bene. But Hegel separated the theory of knowledge. The philosophy of Plato. In regard to Plato's plan by which philosophers ought to rule the state, quote, the territory of history is different from that of philosophy, unquote. Quote, we must recognize that action represents at the same time the endeavors of the subject as such for particular ends. All those particular ends are really only means for bringing forth the idea, because it is the absolute power, unquote. In parentheses 193, Lenin's note in the margin, particular ends in history create the quote-unquote idea, the law of history, end of Lenin's note. Concerning Plato's doctrine on ideas, quote, because sensuous perception shows nothing purely or as it is in itself, unquote. In parentheses, Phaedo, page 213. Therefore the body is a hindrance to the soul. Lenin's note in the margin, quote-unquote purity equals lifelessness, question mark, of universal conceptions, end of Lenin's note. The significance of the universal is contradictory. It is dead, impure, incomplete, etc., etc., but it alone is a stage towards knowledge of the concrete, for we can never know the concrete completely. The infinite sum of general conceptions, laws, etc., gives the concrete in its completeness. Lenin's note in the margin, nota bene, the dialectics of cognition, nota bene, end of Lenin's note. The movement of cognition to the object can always only proceed dialectically, to retreat in order to hit. Most surely, reculer pomissote, savoir? Editor's note, to fall back the better to leap, to know, end of editor's note. Converging and diverging lines, circles which touch one another. Notenpunkt, editor's note, nodal point, end of editor's note, equal the practice of mankind and of human history. Practice equals the criterion of the coincidence of one of the infinite aspects of the real. Lenin's note in the margin, nota bene, end of Lenin's note. These Notenpunkte represent a unity of contradictions, when being and not being, as vanishing moments, coincide for a moment in the given moments of the movement, equals of technique, of history, etc. In analyzing Plato's Dialectics, Hegel once again tries to show the difference between subjective, sophistic dialectics and objective dialectics. Quote, that everything is one, we say of each thing. It is one, and at the same time, we show also that it is many, its many parts and properties. Lenin's note in the margin, quote-unquote empty dialectics in Hegel, end of Lenin's note. But thereby it is said, it is one in quite another respect from that in which it is many. We do not bring these thoughts together, thus the conception and the words merely go backwards and forwards from the one to the other. Lenin's note in the margin, nota bene, end of Lenin's note. If this passing to and fro is performed with consciousness, it is empty dialectics, which does not unite the opposites, and does not come to unity, unquote. In parentheses, 232. Lenin's note in the margin, quote-unquote, empty dialectics, end of Lenin's note. Plato, in the Sophists, quote, the point of difficulty, and what we ought to aim at, is to show that what is other is the same, and what is the same is other, and indeed in the same regard and from the same point of view, unquote. In parentheses, 233. Lenin's note in the margin, nota bene, end of Lenin's note. Quote, we must be conscious of the fact that the notion is neither merely the immediate in truth, although it is the simple, but it is of spiritual simplicity, essentially the thought which has returned into itself, in parentheses, immediately is only this red, etc., nor that it is only that which reflects itself in itself, the thing of consciousness, but is also in itself, that is, it is objective essence." Unquote. In parentheses, 245. Lenin's note in the margin, Nota bene, objectivism. End of Lenin's note. The concept is not something immediate, although the concept is a quote-unquote simple thing, but this simplicity is quote-unquote spiritual, the simplicity of the idea. What is immediate is only the sensation of quote-unquote red, quote, "this is red," unquote, etc. The concept is not, quote, "merely the thing of consciousness," unquote, but is the essence of the object, gegenständliches Wesen. It is something an sich, quote-unquote, in itself. Quote, "This conviction of the nature of the notion Plato did not express so definitely," unquote. In parentheses, 245. Hegel dilates at length on Plato's quote-unquote philosophy of nature, the ultra-nonsensical mysticism of ideas, such as that, quote, "triangles form the essence of sensuous things," unquote, in parentheses 265, and such mystical nonsense. That is highly characteristic. The mystic idealist spiritualist Hegel, like all official clerical idealist philosophy of our day, extols and expatiates on mysticism, idealism in the history of philosophy, while ignoring and slighting materialism. See Hegel on Democritus, nil, ! On Plato, a huge mass of mystical slush. Lenin's note in the margin, Idealism and mysticism in Hegel and in Plato. End of Lenin's note. Speaking of Plato's Republic and of the current opinion that it is a chimera, Hegel repeats his favorite saying, quote, "What is real is rational, but one must know, distinguish, exactly what is real. In common life all is real, but there is a difference between the phenomenal world and reality." Unquote. In parentheses, 274. Lenin's note in the margin, "What is real is rational." End of Lenin's note. The Philosophy of Aristotle. Incorrect, says Hegel, is the generally held opinion that the philosophy of Aristotle is, quote-unquote, realism, in parentheses, 299, id, page 311, quote-unquote, empiricism, in contrast to the idealism of Plato. Here again, Hegel clearly squeezes in a great deal under idealism. In presenting Aristotle's polemic against Plato's doctrine on ideas, Hegel suppresses its materialistic features. See 322 to 323 and others. Lenin's note in the margin, nota bene, end of Lenin's note. He has let the cat out of the bag. Quote, "The elevation of Alexander," in parentheses, Alexander of Macedon, Aristotle's pupil, into a god, is not matter for surprise. God and man are not at all so very wide asunder, unquote. In parentheses, 305. Lenin's note in the margin, merely invert it, precisely. End of Lenin's note. Hegel perceives the idealism of Aristotle in his idea of God. In parentheses, 326. Of course it is idealism, but more objective and further removed, more general than the idealism of Plato, hence in the philosophy of nature more frequently equals materialism. Lenin's note in the margin, Hegel has made a complete mess of the criticism of Plato's ideas in Aristotle. End of Lenin's note. Aristotle's criticism of Plato's quote-unquote ideas is a criticism of the idealism as idealism in general, for whence concepts, abstractions are derived, thence come also quote-unquote law and quote-unquote necessity, etc. The idealist Hegel in cowardly fashion fought shy of the undermining of the foundations of idealism by Aristotle in his criticism of Plato's ideas. Lenin's note in the margin, nota bene, When one idealist criticizes the foundations of idealism of another idealist, materialism is always the gainer thereby. See Aristotle versus Plato, etc., Hegel versus Kant, etc. End of Lenin's note. Quote, Leucippus and Plato accordingly say that motion has always existed, but they give no reason for this assertion. Unquote. Aristotle, Metaphysic, Book 12, Chapter 6 and 7, page 328. Aristotle thus pitifully brings forward God against the materialist Leucippus and the idealist Plato. There is eclecticism in Aristotle here, but Hegel conceals the weakness for the sake of mysticism. Hegel, the supporter of dialectics, could not understand the dialectical transition from matter to motion, from matter to consciousness, especially the second. Marx corrected the error, or weakness, of the mystic. Lenin's note in the margin, Nota bene, not only is the transition from matter to consciousness dialectical, but also that from sensation to thought, etc. What distinguishes the dialectical transition from the undialectical transition? The leap, the contradiction, the interruption of gradualness, the unity, identity, of being and not being. The following passage shows especially clearly how Hegel conceals the weakness of Aristotle's idealism. Quote, Aristotle makes objects into thoughts, hence in being thoughts they exist in truth. That is their ousia. Editor's note, substance. End of editor's note. Quote, the meaning of this is not, however, that natural objects have themselves power of thinking, but as they are subjectively thought by me, my thought is thus also the notion of the thing, which therefore constitutes its substance. But in nature the notion does not exist as thought in this freedom, but has flesh and blood. Yet it has a soul, and this is its notion. Lenin's note in the margin, naive, ! End of Lenin's note. Aristotle recognizes what things in and for themselves are, and that is their ousia. The notion does not exist for itself, but is stunted by externality. The ordinary definition of truth is, quote, truth is the harmony of the conception with the object, unquote. But the conception itself is only a conception. I am still not at all in harmony with my conception, with its content, for when I represent to myself a house, a beam, and so on, I am by no means this content. Quote-unquote I is something other than the conception of house. It is only in thought that there is present a true harmony between objective and subjective. That constitutes me. Aristotle, therefore, finds himself at the most advanced standpoint. Nothing more profound can one desire to know, unquote. In parentheses 332 to 333. Quote-unquote, in nature, concepts do not exist, quote-unquote, in this freedom, in the freedom of thought and the fantasy of man. In quote-unquote nature, they, concepts, have, quote-unquote, flesh and blood. That is excellent, but it is materialism. Human concepts are the soul of nature. This is only a mystical way of saying that in human concepts nature is reflected in a distinctive way. This, nota bene, in a distinctive and dialectical way. Pages 318 to 337, solely on the metaphysics of Aristotle. Everything essential that he has to say against Plato's idealism is suppressed. In particular, there is suppressed the question of existence outside man and humanity, ! The question of materialism. Aristotle is an empiricist, but a thinking one, in parentheses 340. Quote, the empirical, comprehended in its synthesis, is the speculative notion, unquote, in parentheses 341. Lenin's note in the margin, see Feuerbach, to read the Gospel of Senses in inner connection equals to think. End of Lenin's note. Footnote, see L. Feuerbach, Against Dualism of Body and Soul, Flesh and Spirit. End of footnote. The coincidence of concepts with quote-unquote synthesis, with the summing up of empiricism, sensations, the senses, is indubitable for the philosophers of all trends. Whence this coincidence? From God, I, the idea, thought, etc., etc., or from out of nature? Engels was right in his formulation of the question. Footnote: C. F. Engels, Anti-Düring, Moscow, 1959, page 54. End of footnote. Lenin's note in the margin, nota bene. End of Lenin's note. Quote, the subjective form constitutes the essence of the Kantian philosophy, unquote. In parentheses, 341. Lenin's note in the margin, Kant. End of Lenin's note. On the teleology of Aristotle, quote, nature has its meaning in itself, and these means are also end. This end in nature is its logos, the truly rational, unquote. In parentheses, 349. Lenin's note in the margin, quote-unquote end and cause, law, connection, reason. End of Lenin's note. Quote, understanding is not only thinking with consciousness. There is contained in it also the whole, true, profound notion of nature, of life, unquote. In parentheses, 348. Reason, understanding, thought, consciousness without nature, not in correspondence with nature, is falsity, equals materialism. It is repulsive to read how Hegel extols Aristotle for his, quote, true speculative notions, unquote, in parentheses 373, of the quote-unquote soul and much more besides, clearly spinning a tale of idealistic, equals mystical, nonsense. Suppressed are all the points on which Aristotle wavers between idealism and materialism, triple exclamation point. Regarding Aristotle's views on the quote-unquote soul, Hegel writes, quote, all that is universal is in fact real, as particular, individual, existing for another, unquote. In parentheses, 375. In other words, the soul. Lenin's note in the margin lets the cat out of the bag in regard to, quote-unquote, realism. End of Lenin's note. Aristotle, De Anima, Book 2, Chapter 5, quote, the difference, in parentheses, between empfinden and erkennen, editor's note, sense perception, in parentheses, sensation, and cognition, end of editor's note, is that which causes the sensation is external. The cause of this is that perceptive activity is directed on the particular, while knowledge has as its object the universal, but the universal is, to a certain extent, in the soul itself as substance. Everyone can therefore think if he wishes, but sense perception does not depend on him, since the necessary condition is that the object perceived is present, unquote. In parentheses, 377. Lenin's note in the margin, sense perception and cognition. Aristotle comes very close to materialism. End of Lenin's note. The crux here, quote-unquote, außen ist, editor's note, is external, end of editor's note, outside man, independent of him. That is materialism, and this foundation, basis, kernel of materialism, Hegel begins, Wegschwatzen, editor's note, to talk out of existence, end of editor's note. Quote, this is an entirely correct view of sense perception, writes Hegel, and goes on to explain that there is undoubtedly, quote-unquote, passivity in sense perception. Quote, it is a matter of indifference, whether subjectively or objectively. In both there is contained the moment of passivity. With this moment of passivity, Aristotle does not fall short of idealism. Sense perception is always in one aspect passive. Lenin's note in the margin, nota bene, end of Lenin's note. That is, however, a bad idealism, which thinks that the passivity and spontaneity of the mind depends on whether the determination given is from within or from without. Lenin's note in the margin, the idealist is caught. End of Lenin's note. As if there were freedom in sense perception, the latter is a sphere of limitation. unquote. In parentheses, 377 to 378. The idealist stops up the gap leading to materialism. No, it is not gleichgültig. Editor's note, a matter of indifference. End of editor's note. Whether from without or from within. This is precisely the point. From without, that is materialism. From within equals idealism. And with the word passivity, while keeping silent about the term from without in Aristotle, Hegel described in a different way the same from without. Passivity means precisely from without. Hegel replaces the idealism of sense perception by the idealism of thought, but equally by idealism. Lenin's note in the margin, nota bene. End of Lenin's note. Quote, subjective idealism declares that there are no external things. They are a determination of ourself. This must be admitted in some respect to sense perception. I am passive in sense perception. Sense perception is subjective. It is existence, a state, a determination in me, not freedom. Whether the sense perception is external or in me is a matter of indifference. It exists. Unquote. In parentheses, 378. Lenin's note in the margin, nota bene, an evasion of materialism. End of Lenin's note. Then follows the famous analogy of the soul with wax, causing Hegel to twist and turn like the devil confronted with holy water, and to cry out about it having, quote, so often occasioned misapprehension, unquote. In parentheses, 378 to 379. Aristotle, De Anima, Book 2, Chapter 12, quote, sense perception is the receiving of sensible forms without matter, unquote. As wax receives only the impress of the golden signet ring, not the gold itself, but merely its form, unquote. Lenin's note in the margin, nota bene, soul equals wax, nota bene, end of Lenin's note. Hegel writes, quote, in sense perception, only the form reaches us, without matter. It is otherwise in practical life, in eating and drinking. Lenin's note in the margin, quote-unquote otherwise in practice, end of Lenin's note. In the practical sphere in general, we behave as single individuals, and as single individuals in a determinate being, even a material determinate being. We behave towards matter in a material way. Lenin's note in the margin, cowardly evasion of materialism, end of Lenin's note. Only insofar as we are of material nature are we able to behave in such a way. The point is that our material existence comes into play, unquote. In parentheses, 379. A close approach to materialism and equivocation. Hegel gets angry and scolds on account of the quote-unquote wax, saying, quote, everyone can understand it, unquote. In parentheses, 380, quote, we do not get beyond the crude aspect of the analogy, unquote. In parentheses, 379, etc. Quote, the soul should by no means be passive wax, or receive determinations from without, unquote. In parentheses, 380. Lenin's note in the margin, ha, exclamation point, end of Lenin's note. Quote, it, in parentheses, die Seele, editor's note, the soul, end of editor's note, changes the form of the external body into its own, unquote. In parentheses, 381. Aristotle, De Anima, Book 3, Chapter 2. Quote, the effect of being perceived and of sense perception is exactly one and the same, but their existence is not the same, unquote. In parentheses, 381. Lenin's note in the margin, Aristotle, end of Lenin's note. And Hegel comments, quote, there is a body which sounds and a subject which hears. Their existence is twofold, unquote. In parentheses, 382. Lenin's note in the margin, Hegel conceals the weaknesses of idealism, end of Lenin's note. But he leaves aside the question of being outside man, a sophistical dodge from materialism. Speaking about thinking and about reason, nous, Aristotle, De Anima, Book 3, Chapter 4, says, quote, "There is no sense perception independent of the body, but nous is separable from it," unquote. In parentheses 385. Quote, "Nous is like a book upon whose pages nothing is actually written," unquote. Lenin's note in the margin, tabula rasa, end of Lenin's note. 386. And Hegel again becomes irate. Quote, "Another much decried illustration," unquote. In parentheses 386. The very opposite of what he means is ascribed to Aristotle, etc., etc. Lenin's note in the margin, "Ha!" exclamation point, end of Lenin's note. Inside double parentheses, Lenin has written, "And the question of being independent of mind and of man is suppressed," double exclamation point. All that for the sake of proving, quote, "Aristotle is therefore not a realist," unquote. In parentheses 389. Lenin's note in the margin, "Ha!" exclamation point, "He's afraid," double exclamation point, end of Lenin's note. Aristotle, quote, "In this way he who perceives nothing by his senses, learns nothing and understands nothing, when he discerns anything, in parentheses Giori, editor's note, perceives, end of editor's note, he must necessarily discern it as a pictorial conception, for such conceptions are like sense perceptions, only without matter," unquote. In parentheses 389. Lenin's note in the margin, Aristotle and Materialism, end of Lenin's note. Quote, "Whether the understanding thinks actual objects when it is abstracted from all matter requires special investigation," unquote. In parentheses 389. And Hegel scrapes out of Aristotle that ostensibly, quote, "nous and noetos are one and the same," unquote. In parentheses 390. Editor's note, nous is translated as reason, noetos is translated as what is apprehended by reason, end of editor's note, etc. A model example of the idealistic misrepresentations of an idealist, distorting Aristotle into an idealist of the 18th, 19th century. Lenin's note in the margin, distortion of Aristotle, end of Lenin's note. The philosophy of the Stoics. Footnote. Stoics, adherents of an ancient Greek school of philosophy arising about the 3rd century BC and existing until the 6th century AD. The Stoics recognized two elements in the universe, an enduring element, matter without quality, and an active one, reason, logos, God. In logic, the Stoics proceeded from the assumption that the source of all cognition is sensuous perception, and that a conception can be true only if it is a faithful and full impression of the object. The Stoics taught, however, that perceptual judgment arises only as a result of agreement between the mind and a true conception. This the Stoics called quote-unquote catalepsy or quote-unquote seizure, and viewed it as a criterion for truth. End of footnote. In regard to the quote-unquote criterion of truth of the Stoics, quote, "the conception that is laid hold of," unquote, in parentheses 444 to 446, Hegel says that consciousness only compares conception with conception, not with the object, in parentheses 446, quote, "truth is the harmony of object and consciousness," unquote, equals, quote, "the celebrated definition of the truth, and consequently the whole question is one of the, quote, objective logos, the rationality of the world," unquote, in parentheses 446. Quote, "Thought yields nothing but the form of universality and identity with itself. Hence everything may harmonize with my thought," unquote, in parentheses 449. Lenin's note in the margin, Hegel against the Stoics and their criterion, end of Lenin's note. Quote, reasons, however, prove to be a humbug, for there are good reasons for everything, unquote. In parentheses, 469. Quote, which reasons should be esteemed as good, thereby depends on the end and interest, unquote. Ibidem. Lenin's note in the margin, there are quote-unquote reasons for everything, end of Lenin's note. The Philosophy of Epicurus. Speaking of Epicurus, 342 to 271 BC, Hegel immediately, before describing his views, adopts a hostile attitude to materialism and declares, quote, it is already, in parentheses, self-evident, in parentheses, that if sense-perceived being is regarded as the truth, the necessity for the notion is altogether abrogated. In the absence of speculative interest, everything falls apart, and on the contrary, the vulgar view of things prevails. In point of fact, it does not go beyond the view of ordinary human understanding, or rather, everything is lowered to the level of ordinary human understanding, unquote, in parentheses, 473 to 474. Lenin's note in the margin, Slander against materialism. Why? ? End of Lenin's note. Slander against materialism, quote, necessity for the notion, unquote, is not in the slightest, quote-unquote, abrogated by the theory of the source of cognition and the concept. Disagreement with quote-unquote common sense is the foul quirk of an idealist. Lenin's note in the margin, nota bene, end of Lenin's note. Epicurus gave the name of canonic to the theory of knowledge and the criterion of truth. Footnote. In the manuscript, the word canonic is linked by an arrow with the word it at the beginning of the following paragraph. End of footnote. After a brief exposition of it, Hegel writes, quote, it is so simple that nothing can well be simpler. It is abstract, but also very trivial, more or less on the level of ordinary consciousness that begins to reflect. It consists of ordinary psychological conceptions. They are quite correct. Out of sense perceptions, we make the conception as the universal, thanks to which it becomes lasting. Lenin's note in the margin, 4 exclamation points, end of Lenin's note. The conceptions themselves, by the Doxa Meinung, editor's note, in opinion, end of editor's note, are tested by means of sensations as to whether they are lasting, whether they repeat themselves. That is quite correct on the whole, but quite superficial. Lenin's note in the margin, triple exclamation point, end of Lenin's note. It is the first beginning, the mechanics of conception with respect to the first sense perceptions, unquote. In parentheses, 483. The quote-unquote first beginning is forgotten and distorted by idealism. Dialectical materialism alone linked the quote-unquote beginning with the continuation at the end. Nota bene, page 481, on the significance of words according to Epicurus. Quote, everything has its evidence, energy, distinctness, in the name first conferred on it, unquote. Epicurus, Diogenes Laertius, Book 10, Section 33, and Hegel, quote, the name is something universal, belongs to thinking, makes the manifold simple, unquote. In parentheses, 481. Quote, on the objective manner in general, in which the images of external things enter into us, and on our relation to external things, by which conceptions arise, Epicurus has evolved the following metaphysical explanation. Lenin's note in the margin, Epicurus, objects outside us. End of Lenin's note. Quote, from the surfaces of things, there passes off a constant stream, which cannot be detected by our senses, and this because, by reason of the counteracting replenishment, the thing itself in its solidity long preserves the same arrangement and disposition of the atoms, and the motion through the air of these surfaces, which detach themselves, is of the utmost rapidity, because it is not necessary that what is detached should have any thickness." Unquote. Quote, "The sensation does not contradict such an idea when we consider, in parentheses, Zuse, how images produce their effects. They bring us a correspondence, a sympathetic link with external things. Therefore something passes out from them which within us is like something external." Unquote. Quote, "And since the emanation passes into us, we know of the definiteness of a sensation. The definite lies in the object, and thus flows into us." Unquote. Pages 484 to 485, Diogenes Laertius, Book 10, sections 48 to 49. Lenin's note in the margin, Nota bene, Theory of Knowledge of Epicurus. End of Lenin's note. The genius of Epicurus's conjecture, 300 BC, that is, more than 2,000 years before Hegel, for example on light and its velocity. Hegel completely concealed, nota bene, the main thing, nota bene, the existence of things outside the consciousness of man and independent of it. All that Hegel suppresses and merely says, quote, "This is a very trivial way of representing sense perception." Epicurus elected to take the easiest criterion of the truth, a criterion still in use, inasmuch as it is not apprehended by sight, namely, that it does not contradict what we see or hear. For in truth, such matters of thought as atoms, the detachment of surfaces and so forth, are beyond our powers of sight and hearing. In brackets, certainly we manage to see and to hear something different. Footnote. The words in brackets are missing in Lenin's manuscript. End of footnote. But there is abundance of room for what is seen and what is conceived or imagined to exist alongside of one another. If the two are allowed to fall apart, they do not contradict each other, for it is not until we relate them that the contradiction becomes apparent." Unquote. In parentheses, 485 to 486. Lenin's note in the margin, A Model of Distortion and Slander Against Materialism by an Idealist. End of Lenin's note. Hegel has avoided Epicurus's theory of cognition and begun to speak of something else, which Epicurus does not touch on here, and which is incompatible with materialism. Page 486. Error, according to Epicurus, proceeds from an interruption in the movement from the object to us, to sense perception or to conception. It is impossible, Hegel writes, quote, to have a more meager theory of knowledge, unquote. In parentheses, 486. Everything becomes dürftig, editor's note, meager, end of editor's note, if it is distorted and despoiled. The soul, according to Epicurus, is a quote-unquote certain arrangement of atoms. Quote, "This is what Locke also, in parentheses, triple exclamation point, said. These are empty words," unquote. In parentheses, 489. No, they are the guesswork of genius and signposts for science, but not for clericalism. Lenin's note in the margin, "This auch is wonderful," quadruple exclamation point. Editor's note, auch is translated as also. Epicurus, 341 to 270 BC. Locke, 1632 to 1704. Difference, editor's note, difference, end of editor's note, equals 2,000 years. End of Lenin's note. Nota bene, in parentheses, 489, id, in parentheses, 490. Epicurus ascribes to the atoms a, quote-unquote, krummliegende Bewegung, editor's note, quote-unquote, curvilinear motion, end of editor's note. Lenin's note in the margin, and electrons, end of Lenin's note. This, according to Hegel, is, quote, most arbitrary and wearisome, unquote, in parentheses, 489, in Epicurus. In double parentheses, and the quote-unquote God of the idealists, quote, or else Epicurus altogether denies notion and the universal as the essential, unquote, in parentheses 490, although his atoms, quote, themselves have this very nature of thought, unquote, quote, the inconsistency which all empiricists are guilty of, unquote, in parentheses 491. Lenin's note in the margin, nonsense, lies, slander, nota bene, end of Lenin's note. This avoids the essence of materialism and materialist dialectics. Quote, in Epicurus, there is no final end in the world, wisdom of a creator, everything consists of events, which are determined by the chance, external, in parentheses, coming together of configurations of atoms, unquote. In parentheses, 491. Lenin's note in the margin, he pities God, the idealistic scoundrel, end of Lenin's note. And Hegel simply hurls abuse at Epicurus. Quote, his thoughts on particular aspects of nature are, however, in themselves feeble, unquote. In parentheses, 492. Lenin's note in the margin, double exclamation point, end of Lenin's note. And immediately afterwards is a polemic against the quote-unquote Naturwissenschaft heute, editor's note, quote-unquote natural science today, end of editor's note, which, like Epicurus, allegedly judges, quote-unquote, by analogy and, quote-unquote, explains, in parentheses, 492, for example, light as, quote, vibrations of the ether, unquote. Quote, this is an analogy quite in the manner of Epicurus, unquote. In parentheses, 493. Lenin's note in the margin, and the quote-unquote manner of natural science and its successes, end of Lenin's note. Modern natural science versus Epicurus against, nota bene, Hegel. In Epicurus, quote, the kernel of the matter, the principle, is nothing else than the principle of our usual natural science, unquote. In parentheses, 495. Quote, it is still the manner which lies at the basis of our natural science, unquote. In parentheses, 496. Lenin's note in the margin, Epicurus and modern natural science, end of Lenin's note. Correct is only the reference to the ignorance of dialectics in general and of the dialectics of concepts, but the criticism of materialism is schwach, editor's note, feeble, end of editor's note. Quote, of this method of Epicurean philosophy, we may say in general that it likewise has a side on which it possesses value. Lenin's note in the margin, exclamation point, nota bene, exclamation point, end of Lenin's note. Aristotle and the more ancient philosophers took their start in natural philosophy from universal thought a priori, and from this developed the notion. This is the one side. Lenin's note in the margin, nota bene, exclamation point, end of Lenin's note. The other side is the necessary one, that experience should be worked up into universality, that laws should be determined, that is to say, that the result which follows from the abstract idea should coincide with the general conception to which experience and observation have led. Lenin's note in the margin, nota bene, end of Lenin's note. The a priori is with Aristotle, for instance, most excellent but not sufficient, because it lacks connection with and relation to experience and observation. Lenin's note in the margin, nota bene, end of Lenin's note. This development of the particular to the general is the discovery of laws, natural forces, and so on. It may be said that Epicurus is the inventor of empirical natural science, of empirical psychology. Lenin's note in the margin, nota bene, end of Lenin's note. In contrast to the Stoic ends, conceptions of the understanding is experience, the sensuous present. There we have abstract, limited understanding, without truth in itself, and therefore without the presence and reality of nature. Here we have this sense of nature, which is more true than the other hypotheses." Unquote. Lenin's note in the margin, nota bene, end of Lenin's note. In parentheses 496 to 497. With bold and capital letters, Lenin has written, "This almost completely approaches dialectical materialism." Lenin's note in the margin, nota bene, end of Lenin's note. The importance of Epicurus, the struggle against Aberglauben, editor's note, superstitions, end of editor's note, of the Greeks and Romans, in parentheses 498, and modern priests, question mark, question mark. All this nonsense about whether a hare ran across the path, etc., and the good Lord. Lenin's note in the margin, Hegel on the prose of materialism, end of Lenin's note. Quote, and from it, in parentheses, the Philosophy of Epicurus, more than anything, those conceptions which have together denied the supersensuous have proceeded, unquote. In parentheses 498. Lenin's note in the margin, nota bene, end of Lenin's note. But this is good only for, quote-unquote, endlichen, editor's note, quote-unquote, finite things, end of editor's note. Quote, with superstition, there also passed away self-dependent conception and the world of the ideal, unquote. In parentheses, 499. This, nota bene. Lenin's note in the margin, for what did they, the classics, value idealism? End of Lenin's note. Page 499. Epicurus on the soul. The finer, nota bene, atoms, their more rapid, nota bene, motion, their connection, nota bene, etc., etc., with the body, in parentheses, Diogenes Laertius, Book 10, sections 66 and 63 to 64, very naive and good. But Hegel becomes irate. He hurls abuse, quote-unquote, meaningless talk, quote-unquote, empty words, quote-unquote, no thoughts, in parentheses 500. Lenin's note in the margin, for Hegel, the quote-unquote soul, is also a prejudice, end of Lenin's note. The gods, according to Epicurus, are, quote-unquote, das Allgemeine, editor's note, the universal, end of editor's note, in parentheses 506, in general, quote, they consist partly in number, unquote, as number, that is, abstraction from the sensuous, quote, in part they, in parentheses, the gods, are the perfected type of man, which, owing to the similarity of the images, arises from the continuous confluence of like images on one and the same subject, unquote. In parentheses 507. Lenin's note in the margin, nota bene, gods equal the perfected type of man, see Feuerbach, end of Lenin's note. Footnote, see L. Feuerbach, Lectures on the Essence of Religion. Quote, the God of man is nothing but the deified being of man, unquote. L. Feuerbach, Works, Volume 6, Berlin, 1840, page 21, end of footnote. The Philosophy of the Skeptics. Footnote, Skeptics, in this case, adherents of the ancient Greek philosophical school founded by Pyrrho, circa 365 to 275 BC. The best known of the ancient skeptics were Inesidemus and Sextus Empiricus, in parentheses, 2nd century AD, end of footnote. Speaking of skepticism, Hegel points to its apparent, quote-unquote, invincibility, in parentheses, Unbeschwinglichkeit, in parentheses, 538. Lenin's note in the margin, nota bene, end of Lenin's note. Quote, if anyone actually desires to be a skeptic, he cannot be convinced, or be brought to a positive philosophy, any more than he who is paralyzed can be made to stand, unquote. In parentheses, 539. Lenin's note in the margin, bien dit, end of Lenin's note. Quote, positive philosophy in relation to it, in parentheses, den denkenden skepticismus, editor's note, thinking skepticism, end of editor's note, may have this consciousness. It contains in itself the negative of skepticism. Skepticism is not opposed to it, nor outside it, but is a moment of it. But it contains the negative in its truth, as it is not present in skepticism. Unquote. In parentheses, 539. The relation of philosophy to skepticism. Quote, philosophy is dialectical. This dialectic is change. The idea is abstract idea, is the inert and existent, but it is only true insofar as it grasps itself as living. This is that it is dialectical in itself, in order to transcend that quintessence and inertness. Hence the philosophic idea is dialectical in itself and not contingent. Skepticism, on the contrary, exercises its dialectic contingently, for just as the material, the content, comes before it, it shows that it is negative in itself. Unquote. In parentheses, 540. Lenin's note in the margin, nota bene, Dialectics of Skepticism is, quote-unquote, contingent. End of Lenin's note. The old, in parentheses, ancient, skepticism has to be distinguished from the new. In parentheses, only Schulze of Göttingen is named. In parentheses, 540. Ataraxy, in parentheses, imperturbability, as the ideal of the skeptics. Quote, Pyrrho once pointed out to his fellow passengers on board a ship, who were frightened during a storm, a pig, which remained quite indifferent and peaceably ate on, saying to them, in such imperturbability the wise man must also abide. Unquote. Diogenes Laertius, Book 9, 68. Pages 551 to 552. Lenin's note in the margin, not a bad anecdote about the skeptics. End of Lenin's note. Quote, skepticism is not doubt. Doubt is just the opposite of the tranquility that is the result of skepticism. Unquote. In parentheses, 552. Lenin's note in the margin, nota bene, skepticism is not doubt. End of Lenin's note. Quote, skepticism, on the contrary, is indifferent to the one as well as to the other. Unquote. In parentheses, 553. Schulze, in Esidemus, passes off for skepticism the statement that everything sensuous is truth, in parentheses, 557, but the skeptics did not say so. One must sich danach richten, orientate oneself by the sensuous, but that is not the truth. The new skepticism does not doubt the reality of things. The old skepticism does doubt the reality of things. Lenin's note in the margin, nota bene, end of Lenin's note. Tropes, turns of speech, arguments, etc. of the skeptics. Footnote. Tropes, the designation for the reasons for doubt advanced by the ancient skeptics, in parentheses, 10 tropes, and later supplanted, in parentheses, 5 tropes, by Agrippa. By means of these reasons, the skeptics tried to prove the impossibility of cognizing things and the absolute relativity of all perceptions. End of footnote. Lenin's note in the margin, everything in Sextus Empiricus, 2nd century AD. End of Lenin's note. A. The diversity of animal organization, in parentheses, 558, differences in sensations, the jaundiced, dem gelbsichtigen, sees as yellow what to others appears white, etc. B. The diversity of mankind, quote-unquote idiosyncrasies, in parentheses, 559, whom to believe, the majority, foolish, for all men cannot be interrogated, in parentheses, 560, diversity of philosophies, stupid reference, Hegel waxes indignant, quote, such men see everything in philosophy excepting philosophy itself. Lenin's note in the margin, nota bene, end of Lenin's note. And this is overlooked, unquote. Quote, However different the philosophic systems may be, they are not as different as white and sweet, green and rough, for they agree in the fact that they are philosophies, and this is what is overlooked, unquote. In parentheses, 561. Lenin's note in the margin, nota bene, end of Lenin's note. Quote, all tropes proceed against the is, but the truth is all the same, not this dry is, but essentially process, unquote. In parentheses, 562. Lenin's note in the margin, nota bene, end of Lenin's note. C. The diversity in the constitution of the organs of sense. The various sense organs perceive differently. On a painted panel, something appears erhaben, editor's note, raised, end of editor's note, to the eye, but not to the touch. D. The diversity of circumstances in the subject. Rest, passion, etc. E. The diversity of distances, etc. The earth going round the sun, or vice versa, etc. F. Intermixture. Sense in strong sunshine and without it, etc. G. The composition of things. Pounded glass is not transparent, etc. H. The quote-unquote relativity of things. I. The frequency, rarity of happenings, etc. Habit. K. Customs, laws, etc. Their diversity. These 10 are all old tropes, and Hegel, this is all quote-unquote empirical, quote, do not have to do with the notion, unquote. In parentheses, 566, this is quote-unquote trivial, but, quote, in fact, as against the dogmatism of the common human understanding, they are quite valid, unquote. In parentheses, 567. The 5 new tropes are said by Hegel to be much more advanced. They contain dialectics, concern concepts. Also according to Sextus, A. The diversity of the opinions of philosophers. B. The falling into an infinite progression. One thing depends on another, and so on, without end. C. Relativity of premises. D. Presupposition. The dogmatists put forward unprovable presuppositions. E. Reciprocity, circle, in parentheses, vicious. Quote, these skeptical tropes, in fact, concern that which is called a dogmatic philosophy, and in accordance with its nature, such a philosophy must display itself in all these forms. Not in the sense of its having a positive content, but as asserting something determinate, as the absolute. Unquote. In parentheses, 575. Lenin's note in the margin, nota bene, end of Lenin's note. Hegel against the absolute. Here we have the germ of dialectical materialism. Lenin's note in the margin, nota bene, end of Lenin's note. Quote, to the criticism which knows nothing in itself, nothing, in parentheses, not nichts, in parentheses, sic, exclamation point, absolute, all knowledge of being in itself as such, is held to be dogmatism, while it is the worst dogmatism of all, because it maintains that the quote-unquote I, the unity of self-consciousness, opposed to being, is in and for itself, and that what is quote-unquote in itself, in the outside world is likewise so, and therefore that the two absolutely cannot come together, unquote. In parentheses, 576. Footnote. Lenin's remark in parentheses was evoked by a misprint in the German text, which had nicht, not, instead of nichts, nothing, before the word absolute. End of footnote. Lenin's note in the margin, quote-unquote criticism, is the quote-unquote worst dogmatism. End of Lenin's note. Quote, these tropes hit dogmatic philosophy, which has this manner of representing one principle in a determinate proposition as determinateness. Such a principle is always conditioned, and consequently contains dialectics, the destruction within it of itself, unquote. In parentheses 577. Quote, these tropes are a powerful weapon against the philosophy of reason, unquote. Ib. Lenin's note in the margin, BND, Dialectics equals quote-unquote destruction of itself. End of Lenin's note. Sextus, for example, reveals the dialectics of the concept of a point, der Punkt. A point has no dimensions. That means it is outside space. It is the limit of space in space, a negation of space, and at the same time, quote-unquote, it touches space. Quote, but at the same time, it is also in itself something dialectical, unquote. In parentheses, 579. Lenin's note in the margin, nota bene, end of Lenin's note. Quote, these tropes are powerless against speculative ideas, because the latter contain within themselves a dialectical moment and the abrogation of the finite, unquote. In parentheses, 580. Lenin's note in the margin, nota bene, end of Lenin's note. End of volume 14, in parentheses, page 586. Volume 15, volume 3 of the History of Philosophy, the end of Greek philosophy, medieval and modern philosophy, up to Schelling, pages 1 to 692, Berlin, 1836. The Neoplatonists. Footnote. Neoplatonists, followers of the mystical philosophical doctrine, the basis of which was Plato's idealism. Neoplatonism, Plotinus was the head of this school, developed during the period from the 3rd to the 5th centuries, and was a combination of the Stoic, Epicurean, and skeptical doctrines with the philosophy of Plato and Aristotle. The influence of Neoplatonism was strong in the Middle Ages. It was expressed in the doctrines of the leading medieval theologians, and is also to be seen in certain trends of modern bourgeois philosophy. End of footnote. Quote, the return to God, unquote. In parentheses, 5. Footnote. Hegel, Works, Volume 15, Berlin, 1836. End of footnote. Quote, self-consciousness is absolute essence, unquote. Quote, the world spirit, unquote. In parentheses, 7. Quote, Christian religion, unquote. In parentheses, 8. And mass of thin porridge, ladled out about God, in parentheses, 8 to 18. But this philosophical idealism, openly, quote-unquote seriously leading to God, is more honest than modern agnosticism with its hypocrisy and cowardice. A. Philo, about the time of the birth of Christ, a Jewish savant, a mystic, quote, finds Plato present in Moses, unquote. In parentheses, 19, etc. The main point is, quote, the knowledge of God, unquote. In parentheses, 21, etc. God is Logos, quote, the epitome of all ideas, unquote, quote-unquote, pure being, in parentheses, 22, in parentheses, quote-unquote, according to Plato, in parentheses, 22, ideas are, quote-unquote, angels, messengers of God, in parentheses, 24. The sensuous world, however, quote-unquote, as with Plato, equals Uhan, editor's note, non-existent, end of editor's note, equals not being. In parentheses, 25. Lenin's note in the margin, ideas of Plato and the good Lord, end of Lenin's note. B. Kabbalah, the Gnostics, idem. Footnote. Kabbalah, a medieval mystical religious quote-unquote doctrine, prevalent among the most fanatical followers of Judaism, as well as among adherents of Christianity and Islam. The basic thought of this doctrine is the symbolic interpretation of the Holy Scripture, whose every word and number acquires special mystical importance in the eyes of the Kabbalists. Gnostics, followers of mystical, religious philosophical doctrines during the early centuries of our era. They tried to unite Christian theology and various theses of Plato, Pythagorean and Stoic philosophy. End of footnote. C. Alexandrian philosophy equals eclecticism equals Platonism, Pythagoreanism, Aristotelianism, in parentheses 33-35. Footnote: Alexandrian philosophy. Several philosophical schools and trends that arose during the early centuries of our era in Alexandria, Egypt. Their distinguishing feature was their attempt to unite Plato's and Aristotle's philosophy and the mystical Eastern cults. End of footnote. Eclectics are either uncultured men or cunning, die klugen Leute, editor's note, clever people, end of editor's note. They take the good from every system, but they collect every good, but do not have, quote, consistency of thought, and consequently thought itself, unquote. In parentheses 33. Lenin's note in the margin, on the eclectics, end of Lenin's note. They developed Plato, quote, the Platonic universal, which is in thought, accordingly receives the signification of being as such, absolute essence, unquote. In parentheses 33. Lenin's note in the margin, Plato's ideas and the good Lord, end of Lenin's note. Hegel on Plato's dialogues. Footnote: this entry was made by Lenin in German on the back cover of the notebook containing the Conspectus of Hegel's book, Lectures on the Philosophy of History. End of footnote. Page 230. Footnote: Hegel, Works, Volume 14, Berlin, 1833. End of footnote. Sophists. Page 238. Philebus. Page 240. Parmenides. Page 248. Timaeus.